There is no light inside the bomb bay of a B-29 superfortress at 25,000 feet. There is no window, no view, nothing to remind you that you are a human being suspended 5 miles above the California desert inside a machine that weighs 70,000 pounds and does not particularly care whether you live or die. There is only the cold, the kind of cold that does not ask permission. It moves through aluminum skin and leather jacket and cotton flight suit and finds the spaces between your bones. It settles there, it stays, and there is the sound, not engine noise. You stop hearing engines after the first hour. This is something else. This is the sound of the aircraft itself, the low, structural groan of metal under stress. The vibration that travels up through the hook mount and into the seat and into your spine and never quite stops. It is the sound of something enormous doing something it was not entirely designed to do. Cal Merrick listened to that sound and did not move. He was 25 years old. He was sitting inside a machine that had no wheels, no landing skids, no way to return to Earth under its own power. He was hanging from a single steel hook inside a bomb bay the size of a train car, and in approximately 90 seconds, someone was going to open the doors beneath him and drop him into the sky. He had volunteered for this. Nobody had asked him twice. To understand why a sane man would agree to be dropped out of a bomb bay in a jet-powered egg, you have to look at a map of the world in 1948. The Second World War had been over for 3 years. The celebrations had faded, the parades had ended, the men had come home and tried to remember how to be civilians. And then, quietly, without fanfare, the world had arranged itself into 2 enormous armed camps staring at each other across a very thin line. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb. The generals in Washington had seen it coming for years. They had been planning for it. They had built their answer to it. The answer was the B-36 Peacemaker. It was the largest mass-produced piston-engine aircraft ever built. 6 propeller engines pulling, 4 jet engines pushing, a wingspan longer than the entire first flight the Wright brothers ever made at Kitty Hawk. It could carry an atomic weapon from a base in Texas, fly it to Moscow, drop it, and return home without stopping once for fuel. It could stay in the air for 40 hours. It could fly above the reach of most Soviet interceptors. On paper, it was the perfect weapon. On paper, it ended wars before they started. But the generals were old enough to remember 1943. They remembered the 8th Air Force over Germany. They remembered what happened when you sent heavy bombers into defended airspace without fighter escort. The B-17 flying fortresses had been magnificent machines. The crews who flew them had been brave beyond any reasonable measure of the word, and the Luftwaffe had slaughtered them. Not because the bombers were weak, because they were alone. An unescorted bomber over enemy territory is not a weapon, it is a target. It is a slow, enormous, fuel-heavy target that cannot maneuver and cannot run and can only absorb punishment until it stops absorbing punishment and begins to fall. The generals needed a bodyguard for the Peacemaker, a fighter that could travel with it, protect it, kill anything that came near it. The problem was physics. The early jet fighters, the F-80 Shooting Star, the newer designs coming out of the West Coast factories, were fast and lethal and beautiful. They were also thirsty. A jet fighter in 1948 had a combat radius of perhaps 200 miles before it needed fuel. The B-36 needed coverage across 4,000 miles of ocean and hostile airspace. If you gave the fighter enough fuel tanks to fly that distance, it became too heavy to fight. If you kept it light enough to fight, it ran dry before it got anywhere useful. The engineers scratched their heads for months. Then someone in a Pentagon conference room picked up a pencil and drew a very simple picture. A large aircraft, inside it a smaller aircraft, an arrow pointing down. The idea was this: if the fighter could not fly alongside the bomber, it would fly inside the bomber. The McDonnell Aircraft Corporation received the contract in the spring of 1946. The specifications were precise and merciless. The aircraft had to fit inside a standard bomb bay. It could not exceed 15 feet in length. It could not exceed 5 feet in width when its wings were folded. It needed to carry 4 50-caliber machine guns, enough fuel for a 30-minute engagement, and a pilot. It needed to launch from the moving bomber, fight, survive, and then return to the bomber in flight, connecting to a retractable trapeze bar lowered from the bomb bay, locking on, and being winched back inside. It needed to do all of this at 200 miles per hour. Dr. Everett Goss was 58 years old and had been designing aircraft since before most of his engineers were born. He was not a man who frightened easily. He looked at the specifications for 30 seconds, set them down on his desk, and said nothing for a long time. Then he went to work. What emerged from the McDonnell factory 2 years later was the XF-85 Goblin. When the hangar doors opened and the ground crew rolled it out into the morning light at Muroc Army Airfield, the men who saw it did not cheer. They stared. It was 15 feet long. It was round. Its body was shaped like a teardrop that someone had sat on. The tail assembly was a triple-fin design that looked less like an aircraft component and more like a kitchen utensil. The wings swept back and could fold upward like a resting bird. The cockpit sat directly above the jet engine, so close that the pilot's back was essentially the engine's front wall, and on the bottom of the aircraft, where the landing gear would have been on any other plane in the history of flight, there was nothing. Smooth aluminum, no wheels, no skids, no way down. The pilots at Muroc called it the flying pickle. They called it the egg. They asked if it came with a quarter slot so you could make it rock back and forth. They laughed the way men laugh when they are looking at something that frightens them and do not want to say so. Major Dex Whitmore, the most experienced test pilot on the base, looked at the Goblin for approximately 4 minutes. Then he produced a written list of 17 technical objections and submitted it to the project office. The list was thorough, well-argued, and concluded with a single sentence that everyone on the flight line agreed with. No rational pilot should be asked to fly this aircraft. Nobody argued with Whitmore. He had flown everything. His opinion carried weight. The project office reviewed the list. They noted the objections. They asked if anyone else wanted to volunteer. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Cal Merrick raised his hand. He was not the obvious choice. He was 25, which made him younger than half the mechanics who serviced the aircraft. He had flown Hellcats off carrier decks in the Pacific, which meant he knew about landing on moving surfaces in difficult conditions, but that was a different kind of difficult than this. He was not famous. He had not broken any records. He did not have a reputation. What he had was a copy of the XF-85 technical specifications, which he had apparently read 3 times before the meeting. Goss met with him afterward. The older man expected nerves or bravado, or the particular kind of forced confidence that young pilots wore like a uniform when they were trying to seem older than they were. What he got was something else entirely. Merrick sat down across the desk, folded his hands, and said, "Whitmore's right about the landing gear. That's a real problem, and there's no good answer to it. But he's wrong about the wing loading and the thrust-to-weight ratio. I did the math. This aircraft will fly. It will fly well." He paused. "The question is the trapeze. I want to see how bad it actually is." Goss looked at him for a moment. "You understand that if the docking system fails, you have no way to land." "I understand that." "You'll have to belly it in. No gear, no skids, just the airframe against the ground at whatever speed you're carrying." "I understand that too." "Most pilots—" "I'm not most pilots," Merrick said, not with arrogance, simply as a statement of relevant fact. "When do we start?" He spent the next 3 weeks learning the Goblin from the inside out without ever leaving the ground. He arrived before the ground crew each morning and climbed into the cockpit and worked through every procedure in the flight manual until the sequences lived in his hands instead of his head. He practiced the ignition in darkness. He practiced it with his eyes closed. He practiced it while Goss's engineers stood beside the aircraft, shouting questions at him, trying to break his concentration. He studied the trapeze mechanism until he understood not just how it was supposed to work, but precisely how it would fail, and under what conditions, and what the margins were between a clean approach and a catastrophic one. The men on the flight line watched him and said nothing much. He was not the kind of man who invited commentary. The jokes about the flying egg continued, but they were directed at the aircraft now, not at the man who was going to fly it. On the morning of August 23rd, 1948, Merrick ate breakfast, drank 1 cup of coffee, and walked to the hangar. The ground crew winched the Goblin up into the belly of the B-29 Superfortress. The aircraft's pilot was a quiet, deliberate man named Garrett, a veteran of 2 wars who had more flight hours than he could remember and a habit of saying important things in the same tone he used for everything else. He had briefed Merrick that morning without ceremony. Altitudes, speeds, abort criteria, the exact phraseology they would use on the radio. Everything clean and clear and ready. The bomber they called ironclad. Merrick climbed into the Goblin's cockpit. The bomb bay doors closed above him, and the darkness came down. He checked his oxygen. He checked his radio. He ran through the ignition sequence one more time with his hands moving in the dark, each switch found by touch and memory. He felt the B-29's engines build to take off power, felt the aircraft begin to roll, felt the compression of acceleration pressing him back into his seat. Then the ground fell away. The altimeter climbed. 10,000 feet. 15. 20. The temperature inside the bomb bay dropped until the metal framing was cold enough to pull heat through his gloves. He did not think about the ground. He thought about the sequence: ignition, throttle, stick neutral. Do not fight the initial drop. 25,000 feet. Garrett's voice came through flat and even. Merrick, on station, your call. Merrick put his hand on the release lever, took 1 breath, let it out. Opening bay, he said. The hydraulic pumps wound up. The bomb bay doors groaned apart and the sky came in, blue and vast and immediate, a rectangle of blinding light that replaced the darkness with cold and noise and the absolute fact of altitude. The trapeze arm lowered, pushing the Goblin out of the belly and into the open air. He was outside now. The desert floor was miles below him, too far away to feel real. He pulled the release. The steel hook opened with a single, clean, metallic sound. The B-29 shot upward above him, or rather, he fell away from it, which felt like the same thing. For one moment there was no weight, no direction, no up or down. Just the sun and the brown earth and the enormous blue silence between them. Then he hit the ignition switch and shoved the throttle forward. The Westinghouse engine did not hesitate. It did not cough or build slowly. It exploded into full power, and the thrust hit him in the spine like a physical blow, and the Goblin stopped falling and began to fly. The wings bit into the air, the nose came up, the horizon leveled. Merrick pulled back on the stick and the aircraft responded, instantly, precisely, with a sensitivity that no heavy fighter had ever offered him. He pushed the throttle harder. He rolled left and pulled into a climbing turn that pressed him into his seat with the weight of 3 men. The Goblin held. He rolled right. He dove toward the desert floor and pulled up at the last second, the brown earth blurring past close enough that he could see the cracks in the dry mud. He looped. He rolled. He did things with that aircraft that no one watching from the ground had expected to see. 20 minutes passed. The fuel gauge moved. Merrick leveled off and looked up. The ironclad was above him, a silver cross against the blue, the trapeze bar hanging beneath its belly, waiting. He keyed the radio. Ironclad, this is Goblin, requesting approach to dock. Garrett's voice came back without hesitation. Copy, Goblin. Trapeze is down and locked. You are clear. Merrick turned the nose of the XF-85 toward the bomber. He had prepared for this approach as carefully as he had prepared for anything in his life. He had read every technical description of wake turbulence behind large aircraft. He had run the calculations. He was ready. None of it was enough. The moment he entered the disturbed air behind the Ironclad, the Goblin stopped flying smoothly and began to fight him. The turbulence was not violent in the way weather was violent. It was irregular, unpredictable. 1 second the aircraft was level and controlled. The next second an invisible force moved it 3 feet sideways without warning, without logic, without any indication that it was coming. First approach. He closed to within 10 feet of the yellow-painted trapeze loop. An updraft caught the Goblin and lifted it hard. The hook missed wide. He dove away to avoid hitting the bomber's belly. Second approach. Slower, more patient. He fought the controls to within 3 feet of the loop. The Goblin rolled 15 degrees uncommanded. When his eyes came back to the trapeze, the angle was gone. He broke off again. Third approach. He drove in with more speed, trying to punch through the turbulence before it could move him. The hook reached for the loop. He was right there, right on the line. The updraft hit from below like a wall. The Goblin's nose snapped upward. The steel structure of the trapeze bar filled his entire field of vision for a fraction of a second, and then it hit. The sound was a gunshot. The plexiglass of the canopy exploded inward. The wind at 200 miles per hour came through the shattered cockpit and took his helmet off his head and drove broken glass across his face and filled his eyes with white noise. He could not see. The aircraft was tumbling. He found the stick with his hands, not his eyes. He found it and held it and kicked the rudder and forced the nose to stop its rotation through feel alone, through the pressure of the airframe against his body, through physical instinct that had been sharpened to an edge in the Pacific and kept sharp in the desert air of Muroc. The Goblin leveled. He wiped his face with the back of his glove. He blinked until he could see. He looked at the nose of the aircraft. The hook was gone, sheared completely off. The engine had 8 minutes of fuel. He was alone at altitude in a broken aircraft with no canopy and no way to land on a runway. He looked down at the pale white expanse of Muroc Dry Lake spread out below him, miles of flat, hard-packed earth. He picked up the radio. "Ironclad," he said. His voice was level. "This is Goblin. Hook is gone, canopy is gone, unable to dock, going in. Belly landing on the lake bed?" 8 seconds of silence. "Merrick." Garrett's voice was careful. "You cannot land a jet aircraft without wheels." Cal Merrick looked at the altimeter. He looked at the fuel gauge. "I know," he said. "Stand by." The Goblin hit the desert floor at 150 miles per hour. The aircraft struck the hard-packed surface of Muroc Dry Lake, and the sound was not a crash in the way that word usually means. It was a sustained tearing. A long, grinding, metallic scream that went on as the aluminum belly plowed through the earth and the friction built and the dust exploded upward in a wall 50 feet high on both sides of the sliding wreck. Inside the cockpit, Merrick held the stick steady and kept his feet working the rudder pedals and watched the nose. He did not let it go left or right, because if it went left or right, the wing would catch, and the aircraft would cartwheel and the story would end there in the dust. The slide went on for nearly a mile. Then the friction won. The Goblin groaned and stopped. The rescue trucks were already moving across the lake bed, sirens cutting through the desert air, the crews inside them preparing for what they expected to find. They had fire extinguishers, they had cutting tools, they had the particular grim readiness of men who have seen what happens when metal and earth meet at speed. They were not prepared for what they actually found. The canopy opened. Cal Merrick climbed out onto the wing. He was covered in white alkali dust. There were cuts on his face from the shattered plexiglass, already drying in the desert heat. He stood on the crumpled wing of his aircraft, looked down at the shredded aluminum belly, and pulled a cigarette from his breast pocket. He lit it. The first rescue truck skidded to a stop 20 feet away. The crew chief jumped out and ran toward him, and Merrick looked at the man and said 2 words. "How long?" The crew chief stopped. "Sir?" "To fix it." Merrick looked back at the aircraft. "How long to fix it?" In Washington, the answer was never. The project office had the crash reports within 48 hours. The photographs, the damage assessments, the medical report noting that the pilot had sustained lacerations to the face and mild windblast trauma, but was otherwise uninjured, which seemed to strike the men reading it as somehow beside the point. The program had nearly killed its only pilot on the very first flight. The trapeze had failed. The aircraft had been destroyed in landing. There were men in that building who wanted to close the file and move on. What stopped them was a memo, 1 page, submitted through official channels, addressed over Goss's head directly to the project office. It read, without preamble, aircraft performed as designed. Engine, airframe, and flight controls functioned within expected parameters throughout the test. Docking mechanism failed due to aerodynamic turbulence, not mechanical failure or pilot error. The aircraft can fly. The docking problem can be studied and addressed. Recommend 7-week repair cycle and second test series. Assigned, Pilot Merrick. The men in Washington read it twice, then they approved the repair. Nobody called Merrick to tell him. He found out from Garrett, who mentioned it while they were both standing outside the hangar, watching the ground crew load the broken Goblin onto a flatbed truck. Merrick nodded once. He finished his coffee. He went back to his quarters and opened the technical manual to the section on the trapeze mechanism and started reading from the beginning. Dr. Everett Goss worked for 7 weeks as though the problem were personal. He was 58 years old and his back hurt, and he had not slept more than 5 hours in any single night since the crash. But he was in the hangar before his engineers each morning and still there when they left each evening. He redesigned the hook geometry. He adjusted the approach angle specifications. He ran calculations on the turbulence behind the B-29 at 200 miles per hour and produced 3 different modified trapeze configurations and tested all of them on the ground. He was not satisfied. But the calendar ran out before the engineering did. Merrick spent those same 7 weeks the way he had spent the 3 weeks before the first flight, reading reports, asking questions, working through procedures until they were automatic. He read Goss's calculations on the trapeze turbulence. He read them 3 times. He noticed something in the numbers, a pattern in the way the disturbed air behind the bomber behaved at different closure speeds. He wrote his observations in the margins of the report in pencil. He said nothing about them yet. He wanted the data from a second flight to confirm what he suspected. On a cold morning in late October, the repaired Goblin was winched back into the belly of the ironclad. Merrick climbed into the cockpit. The bomb bay doors closed. The Goblin flew exactly as it had on the first flight. Better, even. 7 weeks of repairs had tightened tolerances throughout the airframe, and the aircraft felt precise in the way that well-built machines feel when every component is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The first approach told him immediately that the problem was not fixed. The turbulence behind the bomber was exactly what it had been before. He fought it to within 20 feet of the trapeze loop, and a lateral gust moved him hard sideways. He broke off. Second approach. He came in lower, trying to stay beneath the worst of the prop wash. He got to 10 feet. He held it there for 3 full seconds, which was an extraordinary act of physical precision at 200 miles per hour. The goblin rolled 20 degrees without warning. He caught it. The angle was gone. He broke off again. Third approach. He drove in with more speed. He was 5 feet from the loop. He was 3 feet. The hook on the nose reached forward, and then he felt it. It was not turbulence alone. Beneath the turbulence there was something else, a sustained pressure, a suction, as if the air between the two aircraft had become a liquid, pulling him toward the bomber's belly. He pushed the stick forward to compensate. The suction released. The pressure reversed, pushing his nose down hard instead of pulling it up, and the reversal was instant and complete with no warning between them. He broke off, flew clear, turned the problem over in his mind at 200 miles per hour. He had felt a smaller version of this on the first flight. He had written it in the margins of Goss's report as a question. Now he had his answer. The pilots at Muroc used the word burble for the turbulent separation of airflow from a surface. But what Merrick was experiencing behind the ironclad was something more specific and more dangerous. As the goblin approached the massive belly of the bomber, the air moving through the narrowing gap between the two aircraft accelerated. The physics was straightforward. Faster air meant lower pressure. Lower pressure meant suction. The goblin was being pulled toward the bomber whether he commanded it or not. When he pushed the stick forward to resist the pull, he changed the angle of his approach. That changed the aerodynamics of the gap. The suction became a push. The push became suction again. The cycle repeated faster than conscious thought could track it, and each correction he made created the conditions for the next problem, which created the conditions for the one after that. He was not fighting turbulence. He was fighting a system, a physical relationship between the two aircraft that did not care about his skill level or his preparation or how many hours he had spent in the cockpit memorizing procedures. It did not care about any of it. Merrick noted all of this with the precise, neutral clarity of a man cataloguing a system failure. He did not waste resources on frustration. He observed what the aircraft was telling him and filed the information where it belonged. Then he came around for a fourth approach because the fuel gauge was dropping and he was not finished yet. The fourth approach was the closest he came. He adjusted his closure speed based on what the third attempt had shown him. Coming in slightly faster than the natural pull of the burble could fully deflect him, using the suction as an ally for the final few feet instead of fighting it. He threaded through the disturbed air with corrections so small and continuous that they were less like flying than like balancing. A man walking a wire by keeping his weight always slightly ahead of the fall. He reached the loop. The hook touched the metal ring. For 1 full second, the contact held. Merrick felt the click through the entire airframe. He heard it. Every part of his body recognized it as the sound the program had been working toward for 2 years. On the ironclad above him, Garrett felt the weight transfer and said something on the intercom that was not a technical term. Goss, aboard as an observer, leaned forward over the instruments and went completely still. Then the momentum went wrong. The two aircraft were moving at the same speed, but not in perfect synchrony. A fraction of a second in which the Goblin carried slightly more forward energy than the bomber. The Goblin swung forward on the pivot point of the hook. The trapeze arm swung back against it. Metal met metal with a sharp, concussive blow, and the latch released. The Goblin fell away and dropped back into the slipstream. Merrick shoved the throttle forward and arrested the fall. His arms were burning from the sustained effort of fighting the hydraulic controls through 4 approaches. His hands were shaking inside his gloves, a fine tremor he noted with the same detachment he applied to everything. He keyed the radio. His voice was as flat and even as it had been over the lake bed. "Negative contact," he said, coming around. Goss's voice came back, the voice of a man who had just watched 2 years of work fail by 1 second. Copy, Goblin. Fuel state? 15 minutes, coming in. He did not make another approach. There was nothing more to learn from another attempt that day. The data was the data. He had felt the burble from the inside across 4 approaches. He understood it now, not as a description in an engineering report, but as a physical fact, as something his body knew. He turned the Goblin toward Muroc Dry Lake and set up his approach. The belly landing was cleaner than the first. He had learned the aircraft's ground behavior the same way he had learned its flight behavior, by paying attention to what it actually did rather than what the manual said it should do. He kept the nose straight and the wings level, and when the friction won and the aircraft stopped, it stopped in one piece. The sun was low over the Mojave when the transport truck reached the hangar. Merrick climbed out and did not look back at the lake bed. He walked across the concrete floor and sat down at the briefing table and opened his flight notes to a fresh page. 6 flights remained in the test card. 6 more times he would drop from the belly of the ironclad and go to work. He would bring back what every flight had brought back. Data, honest data, the kind that did not tell you what you wanted to hear. He already knew what the data was going to say. He had known it since the 4th approach of that afternoon, when the hook held for 1 second and then the physics reasserted themselves with the indifference of something that had no opinion about the outcome. 1 second of contact was not a weapon system. 1 second was a proof of concept. It was proof that under ideal conditions, with a rested pilot and full fuel and no enemy aircraft in the area, the mechanism could work once, maybe twice. In combat, with a pilot who had been fighting for 20 minutes and was low on fuel and had MiGs on his tail, that number went to 0. He wrote that conclusion in the margin of his notes in the same pencil he had used since the first flight. He did not underline it or mark it in any particular way. It was simply the next true thing that needed to be recorded. He closed the notebook. He would fly the remaining flights because they were on the test card, and the test card was his job. He would fly them the same way he had flown every flight before, with complete attention and honest assessment and no interest in any outcome except the accurate one. He turned the lights off in the briefing room and walked back to his quarters in the dark. The memo arrived on a Tuesday. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It came through the same channels as every other piece of administrative correspondence, typed on standard stationery, stamped, initialed, routed through 3 offices before it reached the project desk at Muroc. 2 paragraphs. The language was the language of bureaucracy, which is a language specifically designed to say difficult things without appearing to feel anything about them. The first paragraph noted that aerial refueling trials conducted at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base had achieved successful fuel transfer between a KB-29 tanker and a B-50 Superfortress at altitude. The trials were considered a success. Further development was proceeding on schedule. The second paragraph directed the XF-85 project to complete its remaining test flights, compile final data, and prepare closure documentation. That was all, Doctor. Everett Goss read it alone in his office with the door closed. He sat with it for a while. The implications were not complicated. Aerial refueling solved the range problem that the Goblin had been built to solve, solved it cleanly, solved it reliably, solved it without requiring a pilot to dock a jet aircraft to a trapeze bar at 200 miles per hour inside a system of forces that did not care how skilled he was. The B-36 would not need a parasite fighter, it would need a tanker. Tankers were straightforward. Tankers did not kill test pilots. The program was over, not officially. But the memo was the ending written in advance, and everyone who read it understood that. Goss folded it in half, opened his desk drawer, and placed it inside. Then he closed the drawer and went back to work, because there was still a final flight to prepare for, and it deserved the same care as every flight before it. Merrick heard about the refueling trials from Garrett. They were standing outside the hangar in the early morning cold, both of them holding coffee, watching the ground crew move equipment across the flight line. Garrett mentioned it the way he mentioned everything, in the same level tone he used for weather reports and fuel calculations. No editorializing, just the facts and their obvious meaning. Merrick listened without interrupting. When Garrett finished, he was quiet for a moment. "When's the last flight scheduled?" he said. Garrett looked at him. "End of the week. Goss is working up the final test card." Merrick nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked at the hangar where the Goblin was waiting in the dark, and he said nothing about the program ending or the years of work or the 3 belly landings or the canopy that had come apart across his face at altitude. There was nothing useful to say about any of that. The refueling trials had worked. The problem had found a better solution. That was how engineering was supposed to go. He set down his coffee and walked into the hangar. He arrived before anyone else on the morning of the final flight. The building was dark except for the work lights at the far end, and the Goblin sat beneath them in a cone of yellow light that made it look smaller than it was. Merrick walked the length of the hangar alone, his footsteps echoing off the concrete, until he reached the aircraft. He climbed up and lowered himself into the cockpit. He did not touch a single switch. The instrument panel was dark. The engine behind his spine was cold and still. He sat with the aircraft the way you sit with something that is almost finished, without trying to make it into more than it was. He had spent more time in this cockpit than any other human being alive. He knew every surface of it by touch, the curve of the stick under his right hand, the specific resistance of the throttle, the way the seat held him with his arms exactly where they needed to be to reach everything simultaneously. He had the flight notes from every previous mission in his jacket pocket. He had read them the night before, not to find mistakes. He had not made mistakes that mattered. He read them to confirm what he already knew. He had done everything that could be done with what existed. Every adjustment that was possible had been made. The conclusions the data pointed toward were the honest ones, arrived at without wishful thinking or the pressure to produce a result that someone in Washington wanted to see. The Goblin could fly. He had proven that on the first drop, and confirmed it on every drop after. What it could not do, what no pilot could make it do with sufficient reliability to build a weapons system around, was come home. That was the finding. It was the correct finding. It was the only finding the data supported. He sat in the cockpit until the ground crew began arriving. Then he climbed out and went to find Goss. The pre-flight brief was thorough and unhurried. Goss went through the test card item by item with the same care he had given every brief before it: performance points, altitude bands, abort criteria, radio procedures. Merrick listened and asked 2 technical questions and signed the brief sheet. As he stood to leave, Goss said his name. Merrick turned. The older man was looking at the briefing table. He seemed to be working out how to say something that did not have a clean technical form. "The aircraft would not have flown without you," Goss said. "Whatever the program's outcome, that is simply a true statement." Merrick looked at him for a moment. "The aircraft flew because of how it was built," he said. "You built it." He picked up his helmet and walked out. The ironclad climbed to 25,000 feet for the last time. In the bomb bay, Merrick ran through his checks in the dark. Oxygen, radio, ignition sequence. He moved through each item with the same attention he had given it on the first flight, not because the ritual required it, but because thoroughness was the habit, and the habit was what kept the work clean. The bomb bay doors opened. The sky came in. He pulled the release. The engine caught. He was flying. For the first 10 minutes, he worked through the test card. The specified performance points, the altitude bands, the data Goss needed for the final report. He flew them with precision, because precision was what the data required, and the data was the last useful thing this program would produce. He called the readings on the radio in the flat, even voice of a man who is working. Then the test card, was complete. He had fuel remaining, he had time. He looked out at the desert below him, the pale expanse of the lake bed, the brown hills to the east, the hard line where the earth met the sky. He pushed the throttle to the wall. The Goblin accelerated and Merrick rolled it into a diving turn that pulled the horizon vertical and pressed him into his seat with the weight of speed. He pulled out low over the desert floor and the earth blurred beneath him, and he climbed, the engine full behind his spine, moving the aircraft through the air the way it was built to be moved, fast and light and without hesitation. He looped, he rolled, he dove and pulled up and dove again. He was not proving anything. There was no one left to prove anything to. The program was already over. The memo was already in Goss's desk drawer. He flew because the aircraft deserved to be flown. Because a machine built to do something should be allowed to do that thing completely, at least once without qualification. Because this was the last time and it was worth doing correctly. Then the fuel gauge moved to red and he leveled off and looked up at the ironclad circling above him, patient and heavy, waiting. He keyed the radio. "Ironclad, this is Goblin. Test card complete. Preparing final dock attempt." A pause, then Garrett. "Copy, Goblin. Trapeze is down." Then Merrick turned the nose of the XF-85 toward the bomber. He knew exactly what the burble would do. He had mapped every beat of it across 6 previous flights. He knew where the suction built and where it reversed. He knew the invisible hand that moved the aircraft sideways before the correction could reach it. He entered the disturbed air, and the familiar forces came up immediately. The lateral shoves, the sudden vertical pressures, the shifts that arrived without warning and had to be answered before the conscious mind had fully registered them. He worked through it. He was smooth. He was more precise on this approach than on any previous approach, because he carried the accumulated knowledge of everything that had come before in his hands and his body, and the fine motor memory that lives below conscious thought. He closed the distance. He held his line. He reached the trapeze. The hook touched the loop. He felt the suction phase building, felt the air between the 2 aircraft accelerating, felt the pressure differential forming, felt the latch beginning to engage. He held it. He held it through the first surge of the burble, through the moment when the forces were briefly balanced and the contact was real and solid. Then he felt the momentum begin to shift. The same fraction of a second misalignment he had felt on the 4th approach of the 2nd series, the phase difference building toward the same outcome, moving with the same physical certainty as everything else the sky had shown him. He released the approach. Not because the turbulence took him, not because the hook failed. He released it because he felt what was coming, and he chose to end it before the forces made the choice for him. For the first time in 7 flights, the ending belonged to him. Not to the burble, not to the physics, to him. He pulled the throttle back and descended away from the bomber in a clean, controlled brake. He keyed the radio. His voice was the same as it had always been. "Ironclad, this is Goblin. Test complete. Unable to achieve reliable dock. Heading home." Garrett's voice came back without delay. "Copy, Goblin. Good flight. 2 words. The right 2 words." The final belly landing was the best of the 3. He came in on a long, shallow approach, bleeding speed across the full available distance, holding the nose at the precise angle that gave him the most control for the longest time. He felt the aircraft shudder as the stall approached, and he held it at that edge, right at the last moment before the wings gave up. And then the white earth came up, and the Goblin touched down, and the grinding began, and the dust rose in its familiar wall, and he kept everything straight and level until the friction won. Silence. He sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds after the aircraft stopped. He did not check instruments. He did not write anything. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the dark instrument panel and let the silence be what it was. Then he opened the canopy and climbed out and stood on the wing. He did not look at the aircraft. He looked up at the sky. Blue and empty and very large, the same sky it had always been, indifferent to everything that had happened in it. He stood there until the first truck arrived. The XF-85 program was officially cancelled in 1949. There was no ceremony. A memo was generated, approved, and filed. The two Goblin prototypes were moved to the back of a hangar, stripped of their engines and weapons and classified components, and covered with canvas tarps. They sat there for years, untouched, accumulating dust. Cal Merrick went back to work the following week. There were other aircraft on the ramp, other test cards, other problems that needed a man who could think and fly simultaneously. He did not give interviews about the Goblin. When other pilots asked him about the program, he described the aerodynamic characteristics of the aircraft in technical terms that were accurate and complete and did not invite further questions. Major Dex Whitmore passed him on the flight line one morning in early 1949 and stopped. "I was right about the landing gear," Whitmore said. "You were," Merrick said. "I was wrong about the flight envelope." Merrick looked at him. "Yes," Whitmore nodded once and walked on. In the world these men occupied, it was a complete exchange. In March of 1951, Cal Merrick was killed while conducting performance testing on a P-51H Mustang at Muroc Air Force Base. He was 29 years old. He had survived 7 flights in an aircraft that had no landing gear and no way home. He had survived 3 belly landings on a desert floor. He had survived a canopy exploding across his face at altitude, a hook shearing off at 20,000 feet, turbulence violent enough to roll a jet aircraft 40 degrees without warning. He had gone to the absolute limit of what a human being could do in an aircraft and come back each time with his notes in his pocket and his conclusions intact. He was killed in the P-51H Mustang, the most celebrated fighter aircraft in the history of American aviation, the aircraft that had helped turn the air war over Europe, the aircraft that every pilot of his generation had grown up wanting to fly, the most trusted, most proven, most admired machine on the flight line at Muroc. The irony was not lost on the men who had known him, the ones who had watched him climb into the flying egg 6 times and walk away from it each time, the ones who understood what the numbers meant, that a man who had beaten impossible odds repeatedly did not become immune to ordinary ones. The sky had its own accounting, and it did not forgive debts simply because you had already paid more than your share. No one left a formal record of their reaction. In the internal personnel file maintained at Muroc, beneath the standard administrative notations, someone wrote one line in handwriting that was never officially attributed. The sentence was short. The handwriting was careful. He was the only man who didn't laugh. Today, the XF-85 Goblin hangs from the ceiling of the Cold War Gallery at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. It is clean. The aluminum has been polished. The triple-fin tail catches the gallery light, and the instrument panel behind the clear canopy is dark and still. The dents from 3 belly landings have been smoothed over. The alkali dust from Muroc Dry Lake has been washed from the airframe. The hook that sheared off at 20,000 feet has been replaced with one that is whole and unblemished. It looks small next to the aircraft that surround it. It looks, if you do not know what you are looking at, almost like a toy, rounded and stubby and not quite serious. Thousands of people walk beneath it every year. Most look up briefly and move on. A few stop and read the placard. Fewer still stand there long enough to understand what the aircraft actually represents. Not the failure of a program or a footnote in Cold War history, but the specific and unrepeatable commitment of a 25-year-old man who read a set of specifications that everyone else had set down, did the arithmetic, and raised his hand. He was not famous. He did not break the sound barrier. He did not orbit the Earth. He did not have a biography written about him or appear in the standard histories of the era. He did something quieter and, in its own way, more demanding. He looked at a problem that the best engineering minds of his generation had constructed, and he went inside it, and he came back with the truth about it. Not the truth that anyone wanted, the true truth, the one that the data supported, arrived at without ego or agenda or any interest in the outcome except the accurate one. He told that truth in the form of reports and margin notes and flat radio transmissions at altitude, in the voice of a man who was doing his job because it was his job and because it needed to be done correctly and because nobody else was going to do it. That was all. That was enough. The goblin hangs in the gallery and it is clean and it is quiet. The violence has been washed away from it. The dust and the blood and the grinding scream of aluminum against desert hardpan. The men who walk beneath it carry none of that. They see a small aircraft in a large room and they move on to the next exhibit. This is why the story needs to be told. Because the history of what men do in the sky is not only the history of what succeeded, it is also the history of what was attempted honestly, of the men who went to the edge of the possible and came back with accurate reports about where the edge was, who understood that a finding of failure arrived at with integrity and precision is not a lesser thing than a finding of success. It is data. It is the truth about the boundary. And the truth about the boundary is how the next man knows where to stand. Cal Merrick knew that. He knew it in the Bombay at 25,000 feet, waiting in the dark for the doors to open. He knew it on the lake bed, standing on a broken wing in the white dust, asking how long until the aircraft could fly again. He knew it at the end, when he released the final approach on his own terms and turned the nose toward home and said 2 words into the radio that meant everything. Test complete. The engine of the Goblin has not run in 70 years. The desert has been washed from the airframe. The man who flew it has been gone longer than he was alive. But the choice he made, to climb into the thing no one else would touch, to fly it with complete honesty, to report exactly what he found without softening the conclusion that does not wash away, that is still flying,